Brazilian Candomble, the Orishas who survived the Middle Passage in Bahia, Brazil, West African gods, still possess the living in ceremonies unchanged for 3 centuries of colonial suppression. Long before the academic world turned its attention to the sacred houses of Bahia, before anthropologists arrived with cameras and notebooks, before the terreiros became subjects of scholarly inquiry, the Orishas were already there. They arrived in chains, carried not in cargo holds, but in the memories and bodies of the enslaved, crossing the Atlantic in the most brutal migration in human history. What makes the Brazilian Candomble tradition remarkable is not that it survived. What makes it remarkable is how completely it preserved what it brought. The year is uncertain because the tradition itself predates written records in Brazil. What scholars know with certainty is that by the 18th century, in the northeastern state of Bahia, particularly in the city of Salvador, enslaved Yoruba people from what is now Nigeria were reconstituting their religious practices in a form that would become known as Candomble. The word itself derives from the Bantu term for dance or prayer, but the theological framework, the ritual structure, the names of the deities, and the methods of worship came directly from West Africa with minimal alteration. This is where Candomble diverges sharply from its Caribbean counterpart, Cuban Santeria. Both traditions worship the same entities, the Orishas, the divine forces of the Yoruba cosmology. Both involve possession ceremonies where practitioners become vessels for these entities. But where Santeria developed under the heavy overlay of Catholic syncretism, where the Orishas took on the names and faces of Catholic saints to survive in a hostile colonial environment, Candomble in Bahia maintained the African names, the African theological understanding, and the African ritual practices with what researchers describe as extraordinary continuity. In the terreiro, the Candomble house of worship, there are no statues of Catholic saints standing in for African deities. There is no theological compromise with Christian doctrine. The tradition that unfolds in these sacred spaces is as close to a West African Voodoo or Orisha house as anything that survived the Middle Passage. Scholars examining the ritual practices, the songs, the drum patterns, and the possession protocols have traced direct lineages back to specific regions of West Africa, back to practices that continue in Nigeria and Benin today. The central practice of Candomble, like that of Santeria and Haitian Voodoo, is possession. The ayahs, the initiated members of the terreiro, undergo training that can last for years. They learn the songs, the dances, the protocols. They learn which Orisha has claimed them, which divine force will use their body as a vessel for manifestation in the physical world. When the ceremonies begin, when the drums start their specific rhythmic patterns, when the songs call the Orishas by name, the ayahs begin to move. What happens next has been documented more extensively in Candomble than in perhaps any other African diaspora tradition. The possession states that occur during Candomble ceremonies have been filmed, studied, analyzed, and catalogued by researchers for more than half a century. The video archive alone represents thousands of hours of documentation, showing possession ceremonies in their entirety, capturing the moments when the human personality recedes and the Orisha takes control. Roger Bastide, the French sociologist and anthropologist, published The African Religions of Brazil in 1960, establishing the foundational academic framework for understanding Candomble. His work was not the first scholarly examination of the tradition, but it was the most comprehensive, drawing on years of fieldwork in Bahia and presenting Candomble not as a curiosity or a primitive superstition, but as a sophisticated religious system with its own internal logic, its own theology, and its own methods of managing the relationship between the human and divine worlds. What Bastide documented, and what subsequent researchers have confirmed through decades of observation, is that Candomble possession follows specific patterns. The ayahs do not simply fall into trance. The possession begins with specific physical movements, specific alterations in breathing and posture. The person being possessed typically shows signs of dissociation, the eyes rolling back, the body swaying. Then comes the moment of full possession, when the Orisha arrives completely and the human consciousness steps aside. Each Orisha has characteristic movements, characteristic ways of interacting with the community. Ogun, the warrior deity of iron and technology, moves with aggressive, martial gestures. Oxum, the deity of rivers and love, moves with fluid, graceful motions. Zango, the deity of thunder and justice, displays regal bearing and commanding presence. These are not random behaviors. They are consistent across different ayos, across different terreiros, across decades of documentation. The person possessed by Ogun does not move like the person possessed by Oxum. The patterns are specific, recognizable, and repeatable. The ceremonies themselves last for hours. A typical Candomble possession ceremony begins in the evening and continues past midnight. The possessed state persists not for minutes, but for the duration necessary to complete the ritual purposes, which may involve blessing participants, delivering messages, or simply manifesting the presence of the Orisha for the community to witness and honor. This duration, this sustained altered state, maintained through complex physical and social interactions, represents one of the most challenging aspects of the possession phenomenon for skeptical observers to explain through conventional psychological models. Performance cannot be sustained for that long. Suggestion and social expectation cannot produce the level of detailed, consistent, Orisha-specific behavior that appears in possession after possession, ceremony after ceremony, across different houses and different practitioners. The video documentation removes the possibility that observers are misremembering or embellishing what they witnessed. The cameras capture everything, and what they capture is possession states that conform precisely to the theological expectations of the tradition. J. Lowell Lewis, an anthropologist who studied Candomble extensively, documented the physical practices of the tradition with particular attention to how the ayos learn to invite and manage possession. The training process involves teaching the body to recognize the approach of the Orisha, to yield control at the appropriate moment, and to maintain enough physical stability that the possessed person does not collapse or injure themselves. The possession is not a seizure. It is a controlled transfer of agency from the human personality to the divine entity, managed within a ritual framework that has been refined over centuries. This management aspect is critical. The danger in any possession tradition lies not in the entities themselves, but in inadequate preparation and inadequate support. An ayo who has not been properly trained, who attempts to invite possession without understanding the protocols, risks outcomes that from the outside resemble acute psychiatric crisis. The person loses control without the framework to regain it. The possession becomes chaotic rather than purposeful. Well-managed Candomble possessions, by contrast, are characterized by control. The possessed person moves through the ritual space with purpose. They interact with participants in ways that are meaningful within the theological context. They communicate, not through speech necessarily, but through gesture, through presence, through the specific behaviors associated with their Orisha. And when the ceremony concludes, when the drums stop and the songs end, the possession releases. The Orisha departs. The human consciousness returns. The ayo may be exhausted, may have no memory of what occurred during the possession, but emerges without lasting harm. The terreiros of Bahia maintain this tradition today with the same commitment that preserved it through 3 centuries of slavery, Catholic colonialism, and active cultural suppression. The Brazilian government, at various points in history, attempted to ban Candomble, to classify it as witchcraft or primitive superstition incompatible with modern civilization. The Catholic Church worked to convert practitioners to replace Orisha worship with Christian practice. Neither effort succeeded in eliminating the tradition. What they succeeded in doing was forcing Candomble to develop internal preservation mechanisms, ways of maintaining ritual knowledge and passing it to new generations even under hostile conditions. The result is a living tradition that connects contemporary Brazil directly to West Africa in ways that are theologically and ritually continuous. A person initiated into Candomble in Salvador today learns the same songs, the same drum patterns, the same possession protocols that initiates learned 200 years ago. The Orishas who manifest in Bahia terreiros are understood by practitioners not as symbolic representations or psychological archetypes, but as the actual divine entities worshipped in Nigeria before the slave trade began. This creates a situation unique in the African diaspora. While Santeria syncretized with Catholicism and Haitian Voodoo incorporated elements of French colonial culture, Candomble maintained what scholars describe as remarkable fidelity to its African source. The tradition did not simply survive. It preserved itself with minimal alteration, creating in Bahia a living archive of West African religious practice that in some respects is more complete than what remains in Africa itself, where colonialism and Christianization affected the original traditions differently. The academic documentation of Candomble continues. Researchers from Brazil, Europe, and North America maintain ongoing studies of the terreiros, adding to a body of literature that is second in volume only to the literature on Haitian Voodoo. The internal documentation by Candomble practitioners themselves has intensified as the tradition has become more deliberate about preservation, with terreiros maintaining their own video archives and training materials. What this documentation reveals consistently is a religious system that operates according to its own internal logic, that produces repeatable phenomena within its ritual context, and that maintains theological and practical continuity across generations of practitioners. The Orishas of Candomble are not metaphors. Within the tradition, they are understood as real entities with agency, personality, and the capacity to manifest in the physical world through possession of their initiates. The possession ceremonies remain the central practice through which this relationship between human and divine is maintained and renewed. The ayahs continue to undergo years of training. The terreiros continue to conduct ceremonies that last through the night. The Orishas continue to arrive, to inhabit human bodies, to interact with their communities, and to depart when the ritual purposes have been served. Brazilian Candomble stands as the most important surviving expression of the West African Orisha tradition in the Americas. It is the tradition that maintained the greatest fidelity to its African source, that produced the most extensive documentary record of Orisha possession in practice, and that continues to operate today in thousands of terreiros across Brazil with a vitality that reflects both the tradition's intrinsic strength and the specific conditions of Brazilian culture that allowed it to preserve its African character more completely than any other diaspora tradition. The Orishas left Nigeria on the slave ships 3 centuries ago. They crossed the Atlantic in the bodies and memories of the enslaved. They arrived in Bahia, in Salvador, in the northeastern coast of Brazil. They established themselves in the terreiros. They found ayahs to serve as their vessels. They maintained their names, their attributes, their specific patterns of manifestation. They survived everything the colonial world attempted to do to eliminate them. They are still there. If you found this case compelling, subscribe to Vanishing Roads for more documented paranormal investigations from around the world. This story was created with AI assistance based on documented case files. All events reference real investigations and reported incidents.